At this point, Animal Gear Company has figured out its material costs, both in terms of what amount of cost is it going to go into materials that are actually used and can be inventoried, as well as what the total cost of purchases for materials, whether we use them or not, is going to be. The usage is going to be one component of our COGS. The other two components we need to figure out, therefore, are our other two categories of inventoriable costs, our direct labor and our manufacturing overhead. Direct labor might be the easiest budget in this whole process. What we need to do is we need to figure out how many hours we're going to need in total. And to start with that, figure out how many units we're going to have to produce, what our output is expected to be for production during the period, and multiply that by how many hours it's expected to take to make each of our respective models. So for output required, I could have just as easily called this units of finished goods inventory to be produced. We're going to make 550 Cadillacs during the period. We're going to make 216 Doggerifics. So I can go and I can bring those numbers into this budget. Grab them right from the production budget. 515 Cadillacs and 216 Doggerifics. How many hours in total is that going to take us to produce? How many hours are we going to pay our laborers to make those Cadillacs and Doggerifics? Well, our production supervisors who are familiar with this process know roughly how many labor hours it takes to produce one of these units. So we can go, and that's probably been prepared for us by somebody in the know, and that someone in the know looking around says our input quantity per unit of output, the number of direct labor hours that have to go into the production of a Cadillac or Doggerific in order to make 1 unit of output, is 3 direct labor hours for a Cadillac and 5 for a Doggerific. So back on the direct labor budget, I'm going to go and copy those numbers over. It is 3 for a Cadillac and 5 for a Doggerific. And now to figure out the total amount of hours we're going to have to pay for, we just multiply how many units we're going to make times how many hours it takes to make each unit. 550 Cadillacs taking 3 hours apiece is going to require a total of 1,650 direct labor hours to be paid. 216 Doggerifics at 5 labor hours apiece is going to require 1,080 total hours of labor to manufacture those Doggerifics. That's hours, that's not costs. We need to convert how many hours we're going to have to pay for it to how much it's going to cost us. So again, someone in the know, probably somebody in HR, went through and they found our input standard in this case. And for labor, our standard is $10 per hour. The people that assist in manufacturing these pet carriers for us are going to make on average $10 per hour during the period. So I can just go and I can bring that number over for both products. It's not like we pay Cadillac manufacturers any different than Doggerific laborers. They're both $10 per hour. So now I can just go, I can multiply the total hours that we're going to have to pay our workers to work times how much we're going to pay them per hour, and it's going to give us the expected labor cost to produce the Cadillac, which in our case is $16,500. Same process, I can go and I can multiply the total hours needed for the Doggerific, 1,080 times the $10 per hour we're going to pay our employees. And we find out that the labor requirements of producing Doggerifics are going to cost the Animal Gear Company $10,800 during the period. We add those two together, and we get $27,300 as this company's expected budgeted labor cost during the upcoming period. So we got the direct materials we're going to use for production down. We've got the direct labor that we're paying for production down. Last cost component that's inventoriable that we have to calculate is manufacturing overhead. Seems pretty easy, right? We just figure out what the costs are for each of our 3 different components. Well, the issue that we have going on here is we got to figure out firstly what those costs are going to be. We're using an ABC process for our inventoriable costs. So the cost of machine setups, the cost of processing, the cost of inspection, they're all necessary costs for production. They are inventoriable. We're not having anything in our ABC that can't be inventoried. Let's take them down one by one. What is the cost that we're going to have to pay for machine setups during the period? What information do we have to work with? In our info, we know a few things. If we scroll down to our activities over here, we know our allocation rate. Somebody somewhere has gone and determined that our predetermined overhead allocation rate for the setup activity is $105 per setup hour. We've also figured out for the Cadillac that it takes 1.5 hours to set up for each batch that we produce. And each batch of these is going to produce 25 Cadillacs. So we can make 25 Cadillacs with the machines before we have to shut them down for an hour and a half and reconfigure and set up again. For the Doggerifics, it takes 1.75 hours, or 1 hour and 45 minutes, if you will, to set up for a Doggerific. And then as we run those through, we can machine, if you will, 9 Doggerifics before we have to shut down for another almost 2 hours and set up again. So now that we know what costs we're going to allocate, we know how long it takes to set up, and we know how many units we can produce before we have to set up again, we have enough information to figure out how much that particular activity of machine setups is going to contribute towards our inventoriable overhead. How many units are we going to produce? One more time, we can snag this off the bottom of the production budget. We're making 550 Cadillacs. We're making 216 Doggerifics. Because our driver, in this case, is asking in hours that we have, that's how we're going to spread this out, and we have how long it takes to set up each batch, I think we need to convert our units to how many batches that's going to require us to produce. So in our info, it tells us that the batch size for the Cadillacs is 25 per batch. The Doggerific is 9 per batch. We bring that over to the manufacturing overhead budget. 25 units per batch for the Cadillac and 9 for the Doggerific. If we're making 25 Cadillacs in each batch that we produce before we got to stop for a setup, how many batches in total is that going to be? We just divide the number of units we're going to produce by how many units get produced with each batch. Making 550 Cadillacs at a rate of 25 per batch means we're going to have to do 22 batches of Cadillacs during the period to get to the necessary number of units to be produced. And for the Doggerific, 216 of those, making 9 each time, is going to require us to produce 24 batches worth of Doggerifics. Well, let's convert that to hours. We know how long it takes to set up for any one given batch, and now we know how many batches of each product we're going to have to make. So let's go and grab our setup time. And our info tells us it takes an hour and a half to set up for a Cadillac. It takes 1.75 hours to set up for a batch of Doggerifics. Well, if we're making 22 batches of Cadillacs, and each one requires an hour and a half of setup time, that means in total, those 22 batches are going to require a total of 33 hours of setup time. If we're making 24 batches of Doggerifics, and each one of those takes 1.75 hours to set up for, that means that in total, to produce those 24 batches of Doggerifics, we're going to have to spend 42 hours doing setups, basically shutting things down and making sure everything's in order so we don't get any jacked up, unsellable products coming out. And in total, that is going to require Animal Gear Company to spend 75 hours setting up their machines, not producing, just setting up during the period in order to crank out the Cadillacs and Doggerifics that we need. Well, that's good because that is our driver for this particular activity. Our info tells us that our allocation rate is $105 of indirect costs going into each product for every setup hour that it takes. Well, let's go to our manufacturing overhead budget, therefore, and bring over that 105. Bring over our allocation rate. If we're going to spend 75 hours setting up, and each one of those setup hours causes us to incur $105 of indirect costs, that means that we're going to spend $7,875 setting up machines during the period. And we've got that going for us right now. Why didn't I just assign these to the Cadillacs and the Doggerifics? Because they're overhead costs. And overhead gets pulled and it gets spread out later. Processing overhead. Well, what do we have going on over here? The first thing we have is how many units we're going to produce. Nothing changes, right? We're just going to use these same numbers over and over and over again. We're making 550 Cadillacs. We're making 216 Dogorifics. I'll copy them right from the machine setup overhead table down to this one. Next, we have how many hours, since that is the driver for our processing or machining period. As we see right here, processing rate is $10 per machine hour. How many hours are we going to have to spend to produce each one of these units? And our information tells us that machining, according to this, a Cadillac, up here in input quantities per unit of output, takes 11 hours. It takes 11 hours of input of machine hours to produce one unit of output, one Cadillac. So let's go and bring that over to our manufacturing overhead table. Processing overhead section of the manufacturing overhead budget, I should say. And then, what about the Dogorific? How many machine hours does it take to put together a Dogorific? 19 machine hours. This must be one very fancy Dogorific or one very slow 3D printer. So what is the total amount of machine hours it's going to take to make those 550 Cadillacs? Well, if each one's taking 11 hours, let's just multiply those two together. It takes 6,050 hours to produce those Cadillacs. The Dogorific, at 216 units necessary, and each one taking 19 hours, means that in total to machine to process those Dogorifics is going to take 4,104 hours. And in total, across both of our product lines, Animal Gear is going to have to spend 10,154 hours processing, machining these units. Well, our allocation rate is conveniently $10 per machine hour. We think for every hour we run machines, we incur $10 worth of overhead, depreciation, and electricity, and indirect labor costs of repairs and maintenance for our maintenance men. Like all of those things go in there. So at a rate of $10 per hour, and expecting that we're going to require 10,154 hours of machining to get these units produced, we're going to incur $101,540 worth of overhead costs from processing. Then, after the units are produced, before we decide we're going to sell them to the people, we should inspect them. As we see here, they're going to inspect in batches, and it kind of makes sense. It could be really silly to produce one Cadillac and tell somebody, look it over. No, we're going to wait until we have those batches of 25 or 9 Cadillacs, respectively. Send over the batch to someone to look these things over to make sure they're up to snuff, that they're in sellable condition, which means let's just bring down our batches that we're going to produce. We're going to produce, as we found in the machine setup section, 22 Cadillac batches. We're going to produce 24 Dogorific batches. Our driver for this activity is $15 per inspection hour. So we're paying our inspectors $15 an hour to look these things over. Well, if we go back to our manufacturing overhead budget, let's bring those inspection hours per batch over. How long does it take to inspect each one of these units? And our inspection time for a batch of Cadillacs is a half an hour. Our inspection time for a batch of Dogorifics is 0.7 hours. I'm going to go and I'm going to grab those numbers and bring them on over to our table. And our total inspection hours, if we're inspecting 22 batches of Cadillacs, and each one takes a half an hour, that is 11 hours. 11 hours is going to take to inspect all of the Cadillacs during the period. Dogorifics, we take the number of batches we're planning on producing, times how long it takes to inspect each batch, and inspecting those 24 batches of Dogorifics is going to take our inspector 16.8 hours to do during the period. So if we put those two numbers together, inspecting all of the products that Animal Gear is going to make is going to take 27.8 hours. Okay, that's good because that's our driver for this activity. And our driver says that for every inspection hour that it takes to inspect units, we're going to incur $15 of indirect costs. Well, we just said it's going to take us 27.8 hours to inspect. So at a rate of $15 per hour, Animal Gear can expect to have to pay $417 in inspection costs during said period. So let me go and bring this over here. So our 3 overhead costs are going to be our machine setups, our processing, and our inspection. When we add those together, that is $109,832 of necessary production costs besides material and labor that we're going to incur to make Cadillacs and Doggerifics during the period.